In this lesson, we will be setting up our project to use the Supabase database with Prisma as the ORM. So in Supabase, we're going to come over to our database section here. And actually, we need to go into settings at the bottom and then database settings. And we need to reset the database password. So if you were following along with what I was doing earlier when we set up Supabase, we ignored this database password because we weren't using the database at that time. If you've kept that password safe, then you don't need to reset this here, but I am going to reset my password. So we come here, we hit reset database password, and we can specify our own password, or we can get Supabase to generate a secure password for us. So I'll get Supabase to generate that for me. Then I'm going to copy that and just keep it somewhere safe. So for now, I'm just going to paste that into a new file there. And we hit reset, and it will reset the password. So we need to reset this password in order to allow Prisma to connect into our database. Now that we've got the password, let's take a little look at Prisma. So if you aren't familiar yet with what Prisma is, basically what it lets us do is write one schema that's used in both our client-side app and in our database. So if you're creating a database with SQL or anything like that that uses a schema, you have to define every single table and the different columns in that table, what their types are, the relationships between those columns, and all of that good stuff. But then in our app, we've also defined TypeScript types so that we have that data when we're developing our JavaScript app. Now, this can become a bit of a pain because we actually have two schemas here. We've got this TypeScript schema for our application, and then the schema in our database. And what Prisma does is instead we define one single Prisma schema, and from that, Prisma generates all of the TypeScript types that we can use in our application, as well as the database schema. So this ensures that everything is kept up to date, everything is all synced together, and that we are able to develop without any issues. And Prisma also handles things like migrations, seeding the database with dummy data or default data that your application needs in order to function. And so we're going to see that later on in the next couple of lessons as we go through setting up Prisma. So now we're going to set up our VS Code environment to make it a little bit easier to develop with Prisma. One of the first things is to install the Prisma extension. So this adds all sorts of syntax highlighting. It adds linting. It does code completion, formatting, very intelligently does formatting, which is very nice. It will autocomplete things to make sure that you're not missing different parts and that your syntax is correct. And so this is actually a very helpful extension. So install that. We're also going to update our workspace settings so that we can use the Prisma formatter that's built in so that we can get all of this formatting. So if we come down here to the formatter section, it tells us how to update this in our VS Code settings. But one interesting thing that we can do is instead of saving this to our user settings, we can save this to the workspace settings so that these settings live in our project. And this is really cool because it lets us work with other people more easily, especially if we are doing formatting like this. We don't want one person to format the code in one way and then have it be reformatted in a completely different way when we use it. So by putting these settings into the workspace instead, they live with the project, and so the formatting will be consistent. assuming, of course, that everyone is using VS Code. If you do Command, comma, this will open up our settings. And instead of doing the user, we'll just head over to the workspace. And I'm going to search for format. And then I'll enable this format on save here. Now I also want to add in a custom section, and I need to have access to the underlying JSON file. So in order to do that, we can open up that JSON file. So now that we've edited this option here, you'll see that VS Code added this VS Code folder. And inside of that is a settings.json. This JSON has the format on save option. So this will ensure that when we save a file, it will automatically format it. Then we'll need to add another option. And what this one is telling VS Code is that for Prisma files, we're going to set the default formatter to the Prisma formatter. So now when we edit our Prisma schema, it will use the Prisma formatter to tidy everything up for us nicely. So now we're going to set up our database URL environment variable. And this is where we will use that password that we saved just a moment ago. So in order to get that database URL, we'll have to go over to our Supabase settings here. And when we scroll down, we see that we get the connection string here with a bunch of different options depending on how we're connecting to it. But you'll also see that below that is this connection pooling section here. And what connection pooling does is instead of creating a new database connection for every single request that comes in, it will instead create one request or one connection and then reuse that connection over and over and over again. And as your application scales up, you can add more and more connections to that pool. And so this reduces the load on your database and generally improves the speed and performance of your application. Now, for our purposes, we don't really need this, except that we're deploying to Netlify. And Netlify uses Lambda functions, which are serverless. And so with serverless functions, they are spun up and spun down for every single request, which by default would create a new database connection for every single request that comes in, which is not what we want. So we need to use this connection pooling setting in order to force Netlify to reuse that same database connection over and over again. So we'll come down here and we'll copy this string and we'll paste that underneath in here. And right where it says your password, we're going to copy this password into that. But then we also need to append this query string at the end. So this query string tells Supabase that we're going to use PG Bouncer for the connection pooling. And we're going to limit it to a connection of 1. There is more information on how to use Prisma with Supabase. So they have written docs specifically for this. And so if you want to do a little bit more reading on how this works and how we've set this up here, you can go to that. We'll include the link in the description of this lesson. So now we have this URL. We need to add this to our environment. But the key thing here to remember is that we only need this for Netlify when we've deployed. When we're developing locally, we don't need this connection pooling. And in fact, when we try and do migrations and get Prisma to update and work with our database, it actually breaks that functionality. So we want connection pooling, when we're deployed on Netlify, but we don't want connection pooling when developing locally. So to do this, we'll go over to Netlify. And now that we're in Netlify, let's go to our site settings and we'll come down to the environment variables section. So what we want to do is, let me first delete this out. So we have our Supabase key and Supabase URL that we have added in previously. But what we can do is add from the UI here instead of the command line interface. We need to give this the name database URL so that Prisma can pick it up properly. And what Netlify lets us do is specify what values are used in what scopes. So if we're developing locally, we can have one value for that environment variable. And then once we've deployed, you can have a different value. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. For production, we're going to paste in this value here that includes our password and the connection pooling string. But then for local development, we need to come over to our database settings here, and we'll just grab this URI here without the connection pooling. We'll need to make sure to copy our password into this one as well. So it is a slightly different URL if you look at it. We're using a different port for the connection pooling versus no connection pooling. And so we want to make sure that we're using the correct one in the correct spot. So we'll paste that into the local development here. If we take a look here, we can see that we have our production value set and our local development value set, but no value set for deploy previews or branch deploys. So I need to go and fix that because we want to be able to preview our deploys as well. There we go. Now it shows that we have a value in all 4 of these places. We've got 2 different values in 4 deploy contexts. So we're good to go. Except we don't have that database URL in our .env file yet. So if I'll come over here, we can see that all we have currently is the Supabase stuff. So one way that we can get this variable in is by copying and pasting since we have it over here. But normally we would not have access to these variables. They would only live in Netlify because we want that single source of truth that's going to be password protected and going to keep our secrets nice and safe. So one way that we can get them is using the Netlify CLI tool. So if we run this Netlify env command, you'll see that we also have this get. And so if we do database URL, then we can grab the value that we have set here. And notice that this is missing that connection pooling string because Netlify is going to pull only the local development one, as you would expect. So now we can grab this environment variable here, and we'll add it into our environment variable. And with that, we have done all of the boilerplate setup that we need in order to start working with Prisma, which is what we will tackle in the next lesson.